Okay, so this guy asked me on a racetrack if he's dropping off a curb and his tire continues to bounce or suspension continues to oscillate, how can you tell if it's um, like if it's overdamped, underdamped, or if it's just following the road by looking at, I think he had shock displacement, so we can get velocity and acceleration and maybe an accelerometer on the wheel. And so what I was thinking is if so it goes over the curb multiple times collecting data, maybe do 2 or 3 on the damper setting he's currently at, and then do 2 or 3 like a couple clicks up and 2 or 3 a couple clicks down, and then take an FFT of the data. And what that is, it's a fast Fourier transform.
Okay.
And what that is so like, when you get like the bouncy signal, like when you're looking at data and it's an oscillating thing. So there's different frequencies in that, because like a car's got like a wheel and there's a bunch of masses connected to a bunch of springs that all want to shake at their own frequency. And so that all translates in one signal, but you can break that signal down to show how often a certain frequency shows up. You can either add up the frequencies, and so like if you have like a 1 mile stretch of road and you drive over it, every time it recognizes a frequency at a certain amplitude, it like adds it like a bar chart. And then you have a bunch of frequencies from like 0 to whatever you measure on like the x-axis, and then you have you'll have acceleration, velocity, whatever on the y-axis.
Okay.
And so what that does is, so like let's say you have a go-kart and you're going down the track and so it doesn't have shocks, you're just measuring acceleration of the go-kart. And what you'll end up seeing is you've got the mass of the go-kart bouncing on the tire, which is like a spring. And so you can calculate the frequency by the rear axle weight of the go-kart divided by the stiffness of the tire, and then you square root that and you get the frequency. And so what you'll see in the FFT chart is you'll see a really big peak at the natural frequency of the rear axle, because it'll be bouncing there constantly because that's its resonant frequency.
Okay.
And then if you go to a car that has like an unsprung mass, which is like a wheel and tire, like that will sit there and bounce as the car like slowly moves up and down, right? And so with a car, you'll see 2 frequencies. You'll see a big peak around like a sports car will probably be like 1.3 to 1.5, maybe up to 1.8 hertz. Like an off-road or an SUV will be like 1 to like 1.2, 1.3 hertz.
Okay.
And so you see like a big peak at like 1 to 2 hertz, and that's the body motion constantly moving. And then you'll see another peak of the wheel, brake, knuckle, like that other mass, which is affected by the vehicle spring and the tire spring, or the tire, which is a spring. So it's a little more it's slightly more complex math to get that frequency, but you'll see a peak where the wheel and tire is just bouncing around.
Yeah.
And so when you tune the suspension, if it's perfectly tuned, those frequencies won't show up. So like if you have a fully active system where you can fully control the force in the damper that goes into the wheel in the car, you're never going to be at those frequencies because you'll just be like maintaining a smooth ride. What you'll actually be measuring is like the surface of the road.
Okay.
Right? And so if it's perfectly controlled, those frequencies don't show up. Now, if your damper is under controlled, what you'll end up seeing is your wheel and tire will end up bouncing around more because it's under controlled. So it has less damping than it needs to be like well controlled. And so what you'll see is you'll see a peak at like, it's for a passenger vehicle, it's usually like, like a big heavy truck might be like down at 10 hertz, maybe 11. An SUV would be like 13, maybe a sports car would be like 15 to 18 hertz. So like if you're under damped, you'll see a peak there as that thing moves around, along with just the peak of the body at like 1 to 2 hertz. Now if you're over damped, now if you imagine the damper goes solid, you're back to being like a go-kart. So like you won't see a peak at the wheel frequency anymore, but you'll see a huge peak at now the frequency of the car or that axle. And so what he should be able to find if he does this, because I said, hey, if you just look at if you take an FFT of the data, you'll be able to look at it and see that, see how big your peaks are, and you should be able to discern if you're overdamped or underdamped. But he may not have the experience at looking at those and knowing whether it is. So that's why I said run an upper and a lower bound test and then just overlay, like take an average of all of them for each run. Like if you do 2 or 3 for each, average them, but then overlay them. And what you'll see is how the peaks at the body ride frequency and the wheel frequency, you'll see where those are.
So someone who has the knowledge to set these tests up to run them wouldn't have the knowledge to read them? Because like I feel like they're...
You get the experience, like, so you will see peaks at both spots.
Okay.
But to be able to understand for that kind of platform what the ratio of those peaks should look like, you don't have a reference. Way. Yeah, you don't have anything you don't have a point of reference.
Okay.
And so like if this is something you look at all day every day, and I did instrumentation for like 1.5 years in vehicle dynamics, and so I looked at FFTs all day every day, and I can kind of discern this stuff. But so if instead of just running the one test and looking at the data, if he runs the 3, the peaks at the ride frequency and the wheel frequency will move, and he'll be able to see them moving up or down. And the ideal setting is when both peaks are at a minimum, because that means the wheel and tire is moving as little as it can be without making the body move more than it should be. So it's like perfectly balanced. Okay. Because in a perfect world, there are no peaks. So you want to get the trade-off where both peaks are as low as they can be, or maybe for a certain track or setup, you want the wheel and tire overdamped or whatever. Like that's all subjective to how you're running it. Yeah. But overlaying them will show you where they're moving, and so you won't have to have any previous experience or knowledge to know if it's ideal or not from like the one test.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
That'll make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty simple test.
Yeah.
And all you got to do is go over it, collect the data, do a couple clicks on the damper, do it again. So like realistically, you could run it in like 20-30 minutes and then spend an hour or two analyzing data and know exactly where to set your damper.
And they're just like easily adjustable?
Yeah, like my Multimatic ones, they have all those knobs with the numbers on them. So you just take notes of what the numbers are.
Oh.
And then tell yourself what it felt like. And maybe record lap time numbers and other things.
Burritos, levels, and meats.
Yeah, so when you go to different tracks, you can dial in your settings for specific tracks. And then record those numbers so that you don't have to change the valve code every time.
I like that.
So it's still not going to be as perfect as retuning a valve code, but you don't have to retune the valve code, you just do some clicks.
Yeah.
And like sometimes things happen during a race, like you could break a sway bar, and now you need to like if you break a rear sway bar, you're probably going to want to add a whole bunch more compression to the rear so you can get some of the weight transfer back in. Otherwise, you're just going to have a ton of understeer. And so you can't change the valve code in the middle of a race, but you can dial a knob.
Yeah.
So I'll probably send this video to him.